When your entire life is online, you need more than just speed from your internet. Xfinity gives you reliable in-home Wi-Fi coverage, plus protection from Wi-Fi network threats. Go online, call 1-800-XFINITY, or visit a store today to learn more. Restrictions apply.
Find a moment of calm at Classical WETA 90.9 FM. Available to stream now at classicalweta.org or on the Classical WETA app.
Amos Diggory.
May I have your attention, please? May I have your attention, please? Will the Real Weird Sisters please stand up? We're gonna have a problem here. We're the Weird Sisters, we're the Real Weird Sisters. All you other Weird Sisters are fine, but not the victors. Will the Real Weird Sisters please stand up? Please stand up. Please stand up.
Hi, and welcome to the Real Weird Sisters. I'm Martha.
And I'm Alice.
And today we're here to talk about Amos Diggory. Now, this is just a part one of many, Alice. We've got a lot of content to cover with Amos.
We sure do. This is one of the most robust characters of the whole series. And I really want to do Amos justice on this show.
You want to... It sounded like you said, I want to do a misjustice. I literally was like, what is a misjustice? And why does that not sound like a good thing?
Okay, I'll say it this way. Justice for Amos. Is that better?
Okay, that is better. Well, I thought I heard you say, I want to do him a misjustice. And I was like, what?
No, if anything, the opposite.
Yes,
we have plenty to cover here today.
Yeah, so this is going to be a long one, everybody. Buckle in. I'm sure we've got a lot of content to cover. But before we do that, I wanted to give a quick shout out to this past week. Alice and I had the pleasure of going on the Front Row Film Roast. So I guess a week and a half ago, if you're listening to this live, but we didn't shout it out on the Take 5 episode last week, just due to our scheduling. But we were on the Front Row Film Roast on Twitch, and it's still available, recorded on Twitch. We did a commentary on the Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban movie for 2.5 hours, just Alice and me talking with 5 other people. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. It was, of course, very serendipitous that we were talking about the third movie, our area of expertise, getting inside Alfonso's beautiful, dark, twisted mind.
Yes.
It's kind of something that we're known for. So we had a lot of fun talking about that movie. Definitely very goofy. I wouldn't say it was family friendly. It wasn't really out of control. Well, it wasn't like really crazy or anything, but just FYI, probably not for kids.
Not for kids. It was definitely PG-13. Yeah, it wasn't no broadcast, but it definitely did not have the family friendly aspect that our show has. But that was with the podcasters from Tales from Godric's Hollow, which is another Harry Potter podcast, and the Front Row Film Roast, which is a not a podcast, it's a web series, I guess, that they do on Twitch. Lots of different movies and stuff that they cover on there. So very fun. Shout out to our listeners who were able to join us for that. It was a lot of fun. Something a little different from what we normally do, but we definitely enjoyed it.
Yeah, for sure.
And yes, like I said, last week we had our Take 5, Take 4 come out, and we've been having so much fun with our Take 5 episodes. Even though Tim has been there every week, somehow we've had fun. So make sure that you're listening to those Take 5 episodes. We really appreciate feedback on them as well, because they are our new series that we've been doing. It's great to hear what people think of them. It seems like people are enjoying them, but it's always nice Tim especially appreciates as much feedback as possible. So just wanted to give that plug as well.
Right. And no pressure to watch the actual 5 minutes ahead of time. We did a poll on our Instagram, and it looks like a lot of people are not doing that and seem to be keeping up just fine. So if you're not having, if you're struggling to find the time to pack in that 5 minutes, make sure you prioritize just listening to our show. That's more important.
That should be your priority at all times. Yes, exactly. But with that being said, I think it's time that we get started talking about Amos. I wanted to quickly mention Amos is pretty much in the 7 books, only in the 4th book. He pretty much, after Cedric's death, goes sort of MIA. But we are not going to be talking about his arc in Cursed Child today, despite the fact that he does play a pretty large role in that story. It's not something that we consider canon, and maybe one day our character studies will reach out to the Cursed Child timeline, but for now we're not going to be talking about Amos Diggory living in the assisted living home and having issues with his memory.
Yeah, that was one aspect of Cursed Child I was not a big fan of. So I think we haven't...
The one thing. That was the only thing. Everything else was great.
We haven't been talking about other characters' arcs in the 7th, or in the quote-unquote 8th book. So I think we'll stick to the 7-book canon. Even though with Amos, he does have like almost a bigger role in that than he does in the rest of the series. So I can see why people might think we would do that, but we just both decided we didn't prefer to do that.
No. And I think we'll have fun talking about his role in the 4th book. He's in several chapters, like plays a pretty more than a minor role. I wouldn't say a major role, but he's there for 3 chapters, or multiple chapters, three like locations. And I think we'll have plenty to talk about. This might be a shorter episode though, but that's, I think, fine for we do long episodes most of the time. This can be kind of a shorter one. We'll see how long it goes.
Yeah, we'll see how long we can drag this out with plenty of personal anecdotes to round it all out.
Right. So let's start. We haven't done this in a while, but what were your first impressions of Amos, Alice?
So I kind of feel like with Amos, he's kind of an interesting character to think about because I think I had a very like rosy view of him as a kid. And I just feel like I really was like, oh, Amos, he's so like kind and he's just a nice guy who, I like thought he was really great. But now when I read it again, especially with him after the whole Dark Mark moment, he kind of shows like a less pleasant side of himself. So I still think overall he's nice and like fine, but I think he also like ends up kind of caving to some of that unhealthy ministry culture. So he's not quite as great as I used to think he was.
Yeah, I have a similar feeling of like used to have this idea of him being like this really jovial, like just like good clean fun with Amos. And I don't know, I just feel like he's a little bit darker, more sinister than I used to think he was. And just sort of the way he treats Harry, like that's sort of a through line of like he really isn't that he's very bitter towards Harry. First of all, just like when we have him meet Harry at first, he wants to talk about how Cedric beat him in Quidditch, and then at the tournament, he's really like annoyed with Harry because Harry's winning the tournament against Cedric, or he's tied with Cedric, and Cedric is like clearly a little bit embarrassed by his father acting this way. So I do think Cedric's probably the best part of Amos, and that makes, of course, Cedric's death even more tragic. But yeah, I can actually kind of see like how Amos turns into who he is in the 8th book, quote unquote 8th book. It makes sense, honestly.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't think that plot comes out of nowhere. Like, I think it makes sense as well. But he definitely is one who's very invested in his son and his son's success. I think he's kind of one of those people who, kind of is like reliving his glory days through his child.
Totally.
And like maybe Cedric, I think, is more successful than he was. We don't really know how Amos was when he was in school, but I get the impression that Cedric is like, a better, more successful version of Amos. And so Amos is able to kind of live vicariously through him. And then, yeah, obviously it's very tragic then that he ends up losing Cedric, since that seems to be kind of his driving force. But I do feel like that's what ends up in some ways leading him to act a lot more immaturely. Like he kind of puts himself back into Hogwarts student age.
Yes, totally. I think that his son being Cedric, like, I can see why. Like, Cedric is the golden boy. He's really, really cool. He's just like everybody's favorite. Students, teachers, everybody loves Cedric. And of course, Amos is very proud of his son. And he's an only child. Like, I think there's a lot of factors that come into why Amos cares about Cedric so much. And I'm not saying he shouldn't, but I do think that there is a little bit of that living vicariously through him. And I wonder whether Amos was quite as cool as Cedric when he was in school.
Yeah, and again, it's all speculation because we don't know how he really was in school. But I agree. I feel like he seems like he maybe wasn't quite as cool. Or if he was kind of maybe one of those people who sort of peaked when he was at Hogwarts.
Right.
And then now he's always kind of been like looking for a way to get his glory days back. But the other thing is I do feel like he can be sort of prone to kind of like the good old boys club kind of thing. So I think it all kind of fits together. He is a nice guy, but he can sometimes just be kind of swept along in that culture.
Yeah, totally. I completely agree with you. Just to get us started with our first introduction to Amos, is going to be at the port key when they're on their way to the Quidditch World Cup. The Diggories show up while they're on that hill near Ottery St. Catchpole, and he's coming here. Of course, in the movie, we're going to see him and Cedric just hiking in midair or whatever. That doesn't happen in the book, but perhaps it does in everybody's imaginations. But one thing that I always kind of forget is that our introduction is that he works for the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. I definitely don't have that in my mind as like Amos working with magical creatures.
Right. Does that mean he works like hand in hand with McNair?
No, I think McNair works for a different department, right?
Well, I think McNair gets brought in probably. I'm sure they work together at times.
Yeah, I guess so. I was thinking more like, does he work with Charlie ever?
Probably. I think all of those they probably all intersect at times.
Yeah, so I just never really like directly associate Amos with magical creatures, but
Agreed,
apparently
yeah.
that's the department that he works in. One thing that's kind of interesting is that his Hogwarts house is never mentioned or never directly stated. Do you think that he was a Hufflepuff as well?
I think that'd probably be a safe bet. He seems like a social person who kind of does get along with lots of people. I guess I could see like a Gryffindor just because he does seem to be kind of competitive more than Cedric. But I don't know. I think a lot of times it does seem to, be like a genetic thing.
Yeah, and I think the fact that he's so proud of Cedric being a Hufflepuff, like that kind of makes me think he's also Hufflepuff. Like I think a Gryffindor would not be as like, I don't know, Gryffindors might be more conceited about like their son not being in the same house as them or something.
Yeah, I agree. I think like that would be kind of a Gryffindor attitude to be like kind of looking down on Hufflepuff. I mean, that's kind of the perspective we get of this whole series. So I agree. I think like Amos, not that he wouldn't be proud of him, but I think like you're right. I think he seems super proud about him being in Hufflepuff. So he probably also was in Hufflepuff.
Right. So that
certainly not in Slytherin if he's proud of having a son in Hufflepuff.
Right. Exactly. So yeah, it's interesting that the Diggories and the Lovegoods and the Weasleys all live in the same area, and then the other family apparently in the neighborhood is the Fawcetts, who are not going to the Quidditch World Cup. We don't really know much about the Fawcetts other than that they live in this area.
Well, Farrah Fawcett, you've heard of her, right?
Yeah, she is a very well-known Fawcett. And yeah, so that is a good point. Thank you, Alice.
Yeah, not really mentioned in the series, but sort of just a well-known Fawcett in general.
Yeah, she and Celestina Warbeck kind of are in the same like category of like we don't ever actually see them, but we know that they're important.
Exactly.
But yeah, so our first like conversation with Amos is very clear like how much he is proud of Cedric, talking about how they had to get up at 2 to get over to where they are, and he wishes that Cedric had passed his apparition test or was old enough to apparate yet. But yeah, he comes across very genial here. I do think that I can see why we have this like rosy first impression of him. He's very friendly and just like kind of reminds me of just like somebody that you could like talk to at like any kind of random social event and like you wouldn't feel awkward.
Yeah, I agree. And I think like we're partly influenced by Mr. Weasley because I feel like Mr. Weasley kind of thinks that Amos is cool. Because he's like really psyched to introduce everybody to him and that kind of thing. Not that I think that they're good friends or anything, but I just feel like Mr. Weasley seems to have a good impression of him.
Yeah, I do think Mr. Weasley likes Amos. Although after the Dark Mark situation and the next time we see Amos, which is in the Flue Power Fire scene, I do think Mr. Weasley is a little bit less. Amos's stock has gone down in Mr. Weasley's eyes a bit. But yeah, so they discuss a little bit who's who, and then Amos was very excited to see Harry because he gets to go, oh, Ced's talked about you, of course, told us all about playing against you last year. I said to him, Ced, that'll be something to tell your grandchildren, that will. You beat Harry Potter.
It's really funny because Cedric is sort of embarrassed and is like trying to be humble about it and say, like, reminding him that Harry fell off his broom, so it wasn't really like a totally fair fight. But yeah, Amos is just like, I guess this is the one thing where I feel like he's not very typical Hufflepuff, because I feel like generally Hufflepuffs aren't always like this braggy. I guess you do have like Ernie Macmillan, but
Zachariah Smith.
Yeah, so I guess I'm overgeneralizing. But yeah, Amos is just like bragging so much. He's like, but you didn't fall off, did you? Always modest, are said. Always the gentleman. But the best man won. I'm sure Harry'd say the same, wouldn't you?
Right. Yeah, and what's funny is that we don't really know Cedric at all at this point. We've seen him in the third book as this like annoying golden boy, and Fred and George like really have this grudge against Cedric from Quidditch, and then here as well they're like scowling about this scene. They were scowling when the Diggory showed up because of it being Cedric. And it's just like they had never quite forgiven Cedric for beating their team in the Quidditch final. But so it's interesting that Amos is kind of like, he's sort of acts the way that people assume Cedric is going to act. And this like him being, Cedric being humble here, it almost feels like fake, even though, you know, after we've gotten to know Cedric, we understand that this is the real Cedric. But I do feel like Harry doesn't believe Cedric's actually being super humble here.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because honestly, Cedric in a lot of ways is like Harry. Like, he's sort of well-known and popular and stuff, but he actually is very humble and modest. And that's how Harry is too. And you know that if the roles were reversed and somebody was bragging up how Harry beat Cedric, but Cedric had fallen off his broom because of a Dementor, you know that Harry would be humble about it and like be correcting them. And so it's kind of interesting to see the parallels there. And there's always kind of like these people circling around them who are like pumping them up.
Right.
And then they get kind of this false reputation as being like full of themselves, where neither of them is.
Because Harry totally thinks that that's the real Cedric. Like, and I mean, the Cho stuff is going to like really color his opinion of Cedric, of thinking that Cedric is like rubbing the relationship in his face and that kind of thing. And that's really not who Cedric is at all. But I do think that it's an interesting comparison that you'd think that Harry would understand, like, of all people, like, that getting somebody else, like having a constant hype man doesn't necessarily mean that that's how they are.
Right, totally. I think my favorite line from Amos here is, one falls off his broom, one stays on. You don't need to be a genius to tell which one's the better flyer.
Right.
Yeah, that's the whole story.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, Cedric doesn't mention the Dementors here, but I do think that Cedric is trying to downplay it as much as he can. It's just probably hard with Amos.
Yeah.
But yeah, this does give us some good, understanding of who Amos is.
Yes, it does. And you can see, like, I think if we view it out of, like, the most, like, pure of intentions, we can just see, like, how proud he is of his son. It comes across a little bit, like, tactless in a way, because it's sort of rude to, like, be, rubbing that in Harry's face. But I don't think he means it in any sort of malicious way. He's just really proud of who Cedric is.
Yes, totally. He's very, very proud of his son. And we're not seeing Mrs. Diggory here. We'll see her at the end of the book. Very sad, but it does feel like she kind of has more of the modest or humility that she's passed on to Cedric. So I think maybe with her not being there, like, the side of Amos is really coming out, and it's not good.
Yeah, agreed.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Amos here, like, it's kind of funny to me that I always did have such a nice view of him, because this isn't like the best look for him. But again, I think like it is written in more of a funny way, and Harry's not like mortally wounded by this.
Right. The only people who really get annoyed about it are Fred and George. Harry's not like really upset or anything.
Right.
Yeah. So, of course, Amos is a pro portkey user. He just skates through the air with his hiking poles and marches right down to the ground at the Quidditch World Cup. But we're not going to see him for a while at the World Cup. We're not going to see him until the Dark Mark fall out. So he is part of this group that apprehends Harry, Ron, and Hermione in the woods after the Dark Mark has been conjured. And he is going to be kind of sort of another like awkward scene with Amos where he first is like interrogating Winky and then accusing Harry and then accusing Winky again, which kind of becomes turns into accusing Crouch. So he's kind of the bumbling fool in this scene almost, but also, like you said, sort of not the greatest look for him either.
Right, and I guess it's kind of like I kind of wonder why they had him be like the one pointing his finger at everyone. Like, it seems like a strange choice, but I in some ways think it's just because A, we want another chance to like see Mr. Diggory, and B, like
yes,
we needed somebody who was sort of like a third party. Like, it was like, okay, we need to have Mr. Crouch be accused. Well, who's going to do it? Well, obviously not Mr. Weasley, but we need to find like another adult who we already sort of know. So Mr. Diggory ended up kind of just like falling into that role because he was like by just being there kind of.
Yeah. Well, I think it honestly makes a lot of sense, like you said, for the two reasons. First of all, that we have just we want to be reminded of who Amos is again, because Cedric's going to be important in this book. But then I think that like Amos has status in the Ministry, so like it makes sense that he's part of this search party with Crouch and Mr. Weasley. He also, like, him having status in the Ministry means that like his accusations or like his interrogations carry a little bit more weight than others might. And then also he's like sort of on a similar station to Mr. Weasley, so he's not like he can also sort of be put in his place as well, like by Crouch. So it kind of, even though he's not a character, this is sort of the Charity Burbage thing. Like, he's not somebody we knew before this year, other than we knew Cedric vaguely. I think that it does make sense that he's part of this scene because we sort of know enough about him that he fills that role.
This is not falling into the Charity Burbage trap because we've already met him earlier in the book. If this was the first time we'd met him, then it would be the Charity Burbage moment.
Well, I do like it's just so they're all talking and it's in the dark and it says, "A wizard with scrubby brown beard. It was Amos Diggory, Cedric's father." Thank you. 40 pages after we saw him last.
We really like to underestimate the reader here.
This book especially is really good about that. This book and the second book.
Yeah. So, and I also just think Mr. Diggory seems like somebody who can be like swept along by the current. Like, he just seems like he wants to be friends with everyone, kind of, and so you can see how he would sort of want to be the hero in some ways in this scene. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do see that, because I kind of misspoke. I said it was just him and Mr. Crouch and Mr. Weasley, but there are a couple other Ministry wizards there, including a witch it says a witch in a woolen dressing gown, who's unnamed. But yeah, I think, again, I'm glad that it's a named character and it's not the witch in the dressing gown who's interrogating Winky and Harry, because
yeah, that would be really random and weird. So.
Yeah, that would be the Charity Burbage effect, I think, if I'm understanding what you're saying.
That probably is Charity Burbage standing there.
She doesn't work for the Ministry.
Well, it doesn't really. We don't know much about her, do we? She could have worked for the Ministry during the fourth book.
Right. So we find Winky in the woods, and Mr. Diggory is the one who finds her. He's carrying her in his arms, and he deposits her on the ground. And then he's kind of interesting because then he like is sort of gossiping here. Bit embarrassing. Barty Crouch's house elf, I mean to say. Okay, what are we doing here, Amos?
He's definitely in here as like a foil for Mr. Weasley, because Mr. Weasley comes across like really great in this scene as like he's standing up to Amos for being, you know, kind of like Mr. Weasley's always just like telling him off, like, come off it, Amos.
Right. Yeah. And so then Mr. Diggory points out that Winky had the wand, So that's clause 3 of the Code of Wand Use broken for a start. No non-human creature is permitted to carry or use a wand. It sounds like the Code of Wand Use could use some updates.
The Code of Wand Use sounds like, yeah, it sounds pretty outdated, and it sounds like only nerds like have it memorized.
Totally. Yeah, so then Mr. Diggory is the one who sort of, again, he like explains the situation to Bagman when Bagman shows up there. She had a wand. I found her holding one, Ludo. If it's all right with you, Mr. Crouch, I think we should hear what she's got to say for herself.
Yeah, he's like really interested in sort of being the prosecutor in this scene.
Right, and I guess like him being the member of the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, I suppose house elves are under that umbrella, so maybe that's why he feels like it's his place to be doing this.
Yeah, and I just wonder, like, that seems like it seems problematic for sure, like that he may have gotten like some power in his mind about as far as like feeling like he saw a house elf who might have been using a wand, and so then that's why he's getting really fixated in on this, and I don't really like that.
Right, and I'm glad that we do have later on Hermione. I mean, obviously this is going to be the start of the spew stuff, but we do have Hermione later on saying that she really hates the way that Amos specifically talked to Winky, calling her elf over and over again.
Yeah, he's definitely got some prejudice in him.
Yeah, this is, like you said, probably our darkest moment with Amos of like, he keeps referring to her as elf, and he's just like barking at her. An explanation, if you please. Like, I don't know. It doesn't quite sit right with me.
Well, it's bad because it's holding her to two different standards. A, it's treating her like less than a wizard because, you know, she's not supposed to have had a wand or whatever. But then at the same time, he's like, you know, holding her accountable for that to the point where it's like he's not treating her like an animal either. You know what I mean? He's kind of holding her to two different standards of like, he clearly believes that she's capable of making decisions and thinking for herself, but at the same time, he doesn't think she should have the same power as wizards. So that's, I think, where that really disturbs me, just to see how she's treated as like this second-class citizen.
Right, and I do feel like that is a parallel to a lot of justice systems or injustice systems of like when children are tried specifically of like being held to two different standards based on different parts of a person's identity. So I do think that that's definitely a parallel, maybe whether it's intentional or not, I'm not sure, but yeah. So then Harry discovers that that's his wand that was in Winky's hand, and Mr. Diggory, you dropped it? Is this a confession? You threw it aside after you conjured the mark?
Yeah, and the other thing with this is that you just see Mr. Diggory, like, he's a very interesting case study in, like, he's just making all of these connections, even though it's, like, there's no logic to it, but he like wants to be able to solve this, so he's just like connecting all these dots and drawing all these conclusions, and then kind of has to have a moment where he's brought back to earth of like, okay, that makes literally no sense.
Right. Yeah, I completely agree. It's interesting because he says I got carried away. The Harry Potter wiki does give us the translation of the name Amos from Hebrew. Did you know this?
Lay it on me.
It means carried.
Ooh.
So is that because he gets carried away all the time?
I don't know.
I don't know. I just thought that was interesting. But
it is interesting. Yeah.
There's a little bit more now after he accuses Harry. He switches back to accusing Winky. So, you found this wand, eh, elf? And you picked it up and thought you'd have some fun with it, did you? It's really awful to see, and I'm glad that Hermione stands up here. But yeah, Winky's saying that she didn't do it, and then Mr. Diggory does do priori incantatem. Again, it's nice just to set up what that is. And Mr. Diggory's worst moment is when he shouts at her, "You've been caught red-handed, elf. Caught with a guilty wand in your hand."
Well, right, because so again, like, he's ascribing all of these, like, evil intentions to her, but then at the same time, like, not feeling like she's as, like, capable as a wizard. So it's not a good combination of ways that he's viewing her.
Right. So then that gets turned into Mr. Crouch is saying, perhaps Amos is suggesting that I routinely teach my servants to conjure the dark mark. You have now come very close to accusing the two people in this clearing who are least likely to conjure that mark, Harry Potter and myself. I suppose you are familiar with the boy's story, Amos?
I will say, as much as, okay, Mr. Crouch drives me crazy, and I don't know that he's really the second least likely to have conjured the mark, but he kind of did pwn Amos there.
Especially when he says, I suppose you are familiar with the boy's story.
That was a burn.
That's a really good burn. I do love that.
And it did definitely put Amos back, bring him back to reality a little bit. So that's good to see, because this is what I'm talking about. Like, he kind of just like let this wild idea kind of take hold of him, and then he wasn't thinking at all.
Got carried away, his namesake.
He got carried.
He got Amos away.
I think you just would need to say he got Amos.
He got Amos away, yeah, thank you. But yeah, so then Mr. Diggory, he starts kind of he thinks, okay, maybe Winky saw whoever else was there. Then Mr. Crouch says, like, in normal circumstances, you would take the house elf into your department for questioning, but he asks to take Winky with him. And says Mr. Diggory looked as though he didn't think much of this suggestion at all, but it was clear to Harry that Mr. Crouch was such an important member of the Ministry that he did not dare refuse him.
Yeah, I think he's definitely like, he respects the hierarchy. He wanted to be in charge, but he's not in this scene.
Right. Yeah, so then Mr. Diggory gives Harry back his wand, and then that's pretty much it we see from Amos. We have Hermione's commentary a little bit later of saying, like, how he was calling her elf the whole time. And but yeah, that's definitely our darkest scene with Amos. It's also probably the most that we see Amos in this book. So any other thoughts on this scene?
Well, again, I'm a little bit horrified with myself that I used to, like, just totally skim over this to where I wasn't even concerned about this. I would just think, oh, Amos. And I mean, I know he's complex because obviously this plot with Cedric, it does make him very sympathetic, and you do feel really bad for him. So I think that's definitely what I focused on as a kid. But you're right, like, this is really our biggest characterization of him, because I think any father would react, or most fathers would react similarly to Amos.
Right. So yeah, this is probably like I said, our largest scene of Amos in the whole series. It's not the most endearing one by any means, but it does make him a little bit more complex than if we just had the father, like the crying father, at the end of the book.
Yeah, it does. And I appreciate that we get him to be like a more three-dimensional character than he's not just the 2D character to feel sorry for. Right.
So our next scene with Amos is going to be when he's in the Weasley's fireplace, and this sparked a lot of conversation in our first book club episode about this, of how on earth he ends up eating toast. How does that work with the flu powder? Because apparently the head in the fire is not sentient, like real enough. I don't even know. It's his real head, because he's eating it and it goes back to his body somehow. I don't know.
It was definitely, physically totally impossible. I mean, we know that, this is magic, obviously, but it really did call into question exactly how this is working physically.
It definitely calls that into question. But yeah, he's there. It says he's described as his head looks like a large bearded egg. And he's talking about Mad-Eye Moody's break-in. Muggle neighbors heard bangs and shouting, so they went and called those, please men.
It seems kind of random that Amos was there. Why do you think he was involved if he's there, or if he's the magical creatures guy?
It says that he was, it's a stroke of luck that he heard about it. He had to come to the office early to send a couple of owls, and he found the improper use of magic lot.
Okay.
So I think it seems like you've talked a little bit about the boys club that we hear about at the Ministry, of Amos and Arthur kind of being like Mad Eye's friends, who are like still connected. So it's like Amos, it's like a coincidence that he happened to hear about this situation happening, and he's now reaching out to Arthur because he wants to get this covered up, so that, for instance, Rita Skeeter doesn't hear about it. He mentions her.
Okay.
But I think also so that the other people within the ministry, like, so it's staying within people who respect Mad Eye.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I think, yeah, again, this is just probably the reason we have Amos doing that is because we don't know many other ministry officials at this point, and it just makes sense, like, to have another scene with Mr. Diggory.
Right, and I think that this is a little bit more friendly, or it gives us a little bit better impression of Amos. The fact that we don't know Mad Eye at this point, but now that we do, like, reading this back, it does seem like Mad Eye and Amos had a good relationship, and the fact that Amos respects Mad Eye enough to want to protect him here and get Arthur's help in protecting him, that's kind of endearing for what we know about him.
Yeah, definitely. And then, yes, we do get this classic scene with the toast. That has to be my favorite Amos moment of the whole series, because I like how Mrs. Weasley's sort of like teasing him with it. Sure you won't have a bit of toast or anything before you go? And he's like, oh, go on then.
Oh, go on then. Yeah, but I was going to mention here, because it says that Amos is talking here. He's like, you know what Mad Eye's like, but if the improper use of magic lock got their hands on Mad Eye, he's had it. Think of his record. We've got to get him off on a minor charge, something in your department. What are exploding dustbins worth? So this is sort of that, like, bureaucracy of, like, what kind of what kind of charge can we give him that won't affect his reputation too much?
Right, yeah, definitely like a kind of privileged moment for Mad Eye.
Right. Mr. Weasley, might be a caution. Mad Eye didn't use his wand. He didn't actually attack anyone. So, yeah, they're definitely, that Mr. Diggory, he probably did, but they'll have a job proving it. There aren't any casualties. So this is a little, like you said, Mad Eye definitely has some privilege here within the ministry of what he's able to get away with.
Right, and we know,
legally.
Obviously, we know that this is not the real story of what actually happened at Mad Eye's house. This is just what it seems like happened. But yes, if this was the real Mad Eye, it shows, like, you know, he's in a lot of ways above the law and can kind of get away with stuff that other people wouldn't be able to.
Right. So then, yeah, before Mrs. Weasley gives him the toast, he explains, he does, this is, again, an endearing moment for Amos. He apologizes to Molly. Sorry about this, bothering you so early and everything, but Arthur's the only one who can get Mad Eye off, and Mad Eye's supposed to be starting his new job today. So I think that sort of connects him to Dumbledore, too. It connects to Amos to Dumbledore of, like, wanting Mad Eye to be able to work at Hogwarts still.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Like, as much as this is a little bit, like, irritating to see how they can kind of work the justice system, it's also, at the same time, it shows, you know, the loyalty that they have towards him for everything he's done for the ministry in the past, like, as an Auror.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, then Mrs. Weasley gives him some buttered toast, puts it into the fire tongs, and transferred it into Mr. Diggory's mouth. Thanks. And then he vanishes. I really don't understand, but whatever.
I mean, he did leave, like, right away. So he was maybe
he's like, I've got to get back to my body so that I can digest this toast.
It's possible that he just literally, you know, held the toast in his mouth and then went back.
I don't think so.
It's possible, though. This is what I'm saying. That actually, I mean, we didn't see him eat the whole piece of toast before he left.
Yeah, but, I mean, I don't know. I just think that I guess that could be it, but I don't think that that's what it's supposed to be. I mean,
physically, there's other issues here, too, like the fact that he's able to speak when, you know, it's just his head. He's not, like, his voice box and stuff is back in the other side, like, that's kind of interesting as well.
Yeah, well, and I just don't really understand how he can hold something within his teeth, like his head is that solid.
Well, but okay, that is not the concern that I had.
Well, don't you picture the head in the fire like a mirage, like a smoking mirage?
Yeah. I always did picture it as a physical head.
I sort of picture it like a ghost head.
And that would make more sense. It would work better. But then you're right. Yeah, holding the toast in his head would be weird. But, like,
so that's why it's hard for me to picture that.
I literally, I mean, I agree. I think that would be more plausible to have it be like sort of a holographic version of your head. But I actually always thought it was his head.
Yeah, well, I mean,
you're
it
sticking
does,
your head into the fire. It's like flue powder but you just only part way go.
Yeah, I guess you're right.
But
It's
you're
hard-
sort of
I don't know.
splinched doing that then.
A lot of this is confusing.
So many unanswered questions.
Yeah. Well, so that's pretty much it for Amos until the third task. So any other thoughts on Amos before we get to this depressing stuff?
No. I will say one thing we didn't really address was the fact that a lot of the comments he was making about Cedric were like a pretty heavy-handed foreshadowing of how tragic everything's going to be, like how he's always talking about Cedric in the future and Cedric talking to his grandchildren and everything. So that's definitely in there as a foreshadowing tactic and just to kind of, on a reread, you feel bad.
Right, that's definitely, especially when he talks about his future grandkids or Cedric talking to his kids, like that definitely has a lot of tragic overtones to it.
Mm-hmm.
So before the third task, we do see Amos and Mrs. Diggory are there with Mrs. Weasley and Bill. Amos, there you are you? He's looking Harry up and down. Bet you're not feeling quite as full of yourself now Cedric's caught you up on points, are you?
I like how Amos was pretty prone to believing everything that Rita Skeeter wrote because, Cedric says he's been angry ever since Rita Skeeter's article about the Triwizard Tournament when she made it out like Harry was the only Hogwarts champion. It's funny because Mrs. Weasley was also kind of tricked by Rita Skeeter at one point. So it's funny just to see that even these people who have a very low opinion of her still get swayed by her words.
It's funny because Mrs. Weasley, like you said, also gets tricked by Rita Skeeter, but she gets mad at Amos here. Rita Skeeter goes out of her way to cause trouble, Amos. I would have thought you'd know that working at the ministry.
Right. And he's the one who, earlier was like, we don't want Rita to get a hold of this story about Mad Eye. So, like, they're all aware that she's, full of it, but somehow they all seem very prone to also falling for what she
power.
writes.
Yeah, she really is powerful.
Yeah.
So then it does show that Mrs. Diggory lays a hand on Amos's arm, and so he shrugs and turns away at that. But it's kind of, it adds to the horrible feeling of what happens to Cedric, because Amos clearly is like already carrying this resentment toward he's Amosing it, or he Amos it. He Amos resentment towards Harry. So it's going to be, I think, even more awkward for Harry, like of knowing, like, of feeling responsible for Cedric's death, even though he shouldn't.
Right. I think, like, it's just, it definitely adds to that because they're not, like, on a good note when they go into the maze.
Yeah, and it kind of adds again to the way that Harry sees Cedric, because even though Cedric always apologizes for his father's actions, like, I do think that Harry thinks that that's who Cedric really is a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know. I think by this point in the book, Harry has gotten a little bit more used to Cedric and understands him more. But I agree. Like, I don't think this helps.
Right, but I mean, like, even the moment when Harry, like, tells Cedric to take the cup with him, like, he still is, like, kind of annoyed with Cedric and, like, oh, you don't have to always be so noble and, like, that kind of thing. So I do think that seeing Amos doesn't help, like we said.
Right. No, I agree. And just also, again, this is sort of when you reread it and you go back and you know what's going to happen to Cedric, seeing Mr. Dick, seeing the parents, both of them, like, ahead of time definitely is kind of like a sucker punch, because you just know, like, they don't know this is the last time with their son and they don't know what's going to happen, and so it's pretty heartbreaking.
Yeah, it definitely is. Definitely adds to this really tragic death of Cedric. And so, we're going to see Amos 2 more times. First of all, we don't actually see him shout, "My son," but we can give a quick, like, I do think that the movie scene of this, while corny, like I've always said, I do think they do really well with the band playing, and then it does really hit you in the feels. So I will say the movie does that scene pretty well.
Yeah, I agree. I think the movie dwells on it a little bit more than the book does. This is very brief in the book that we see. There's kind of like just these flashes of what's going on, but Barty Crouch Jr. is there pretty quickly to pull Harry away.
You mean Barty Crouch Jr.?
Junior. Yeah. But yeah, so this scene, we just see that Amos Diggory is like running over, and that the parents are in the stands, but we don't see like actually them reacting to Cedric beyond that, which I'm glad, because it is very upsetting in the movie, and I think it would be in the book too, but it definitely is a quicker scene here.
Yeah, totally. Just a quick mention of Fudge saying, Dumbledore, Amos Diggory's running. He's coming over. Don't you think you should tell him before he sees? And then Barty Crouch Jr. takes Harry away before we actually see Amos.
And I know this isn't a Fudge character study, but typical Fudge, too, that he's like, Dumbledore, don't you think you should tell him?
Right.
Not like I'm the Minister of Magic. Maybe
right.
I need to go, intercept Mr. Diggory before he gets over here.
No, it's Dumbledore's job, of course.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we'll see Amos one last time, and this is when Harry talks to him and Mrs. Diggory briefly. It says Mr. Diggory sobbed through most of the interview, and Mrs. Diggory's grief seemed to be beyond tears. So we don't actually hear anything from Amos. Mrs. Diggory's the one who speaks here. She says to Amos, like, oh, he died just when he'd won the tournament. He must have been happy. Getting all teary thinking just reading that out loud. And then Harry offers the gold to them, which I always hate.
Yeah.
And yeah,
that's awful.
She says, oh no, it's yours, dear. I couldn't.
Yeah, and it is nice to see that it says that they didn't blame him for what had happened, and they both thanked him for returning Cedric's body. So even though Amos did have sort of a negative vibe going with Harry previous, like, it doesn't sound like that carried over, so that's good. But I agree, this scene is, even though it's brief as well, very heartbreaking, and just to think like Amos seems to have, he doesn't seem to be able to talk much.
Yeah, it's really interesting that, it kind of does feel like a gender role reversal in a way, of that we see Amos is just weeping throughout this whole interview, and Mrs. Diggory is the one who's not outwardly emotional about it. It seems like, it says her grief seemed to be beyond tears. Like, so I do think that is interesting. It shows a little bit about his character, that he's so openly emotional.
Yeah, and it is just, we'll see him in the 8th book. I like how we keep calling it that. In the 8th book, obviously we see that this really does just completely change the course of his life, ruins his life. But I always imagined that for Amos and his wife. Like, this was their only child. Obviously super tragic what happened, and just, it's hard to imagine how they could get over that.
Yeah, exactly. So I do think it's kind of interesting to think about, like, what would have happened to Amos had Cedric not died. Do you think that Amos would have been involved with the Order? Do you think that he would have been, like, a more active player in the Second Wizarding War? Or do you think that it's just hard to say?
I don't know. I almost see him, like, I know in some ways he seems to be somewhat aligned with some of the right people, but I also could see him just, like, going with the Ministry on stuff.
Yeah, I kind of feel like he would have been sort of that Dirk Cresswell type of, like, sort of aligned with the Order, but not actually actively involved with the Order, and that is what he was. But I do think that there's a chance of, like, had Cedric lived to tell the tale, had Cedric been there for Voldemort, like, being reborn, like, I do think that would have increased the likelihood of Amos wanting to be involved.
Yeah, I
so
agree.
There's a lot of what ifs with that scenario, so it's kind of hard to really say. But
and I don't
think that
I don't blame him in any way, like, for not being more involved with the Order,
right?
Because I know, like, they're going through a lot. But in some ways I'm a little surprised that they didn't want to take more of an active revenge kind of thing for their son. But everybody reacts differently, so can't necessarily. I just feel like that would have been kind of a typical for a fictional series, that they would have gotten really involved with the cause.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of what I was thinking too. I think that their grief is so powerful that that's why they're not involved. But I do think that they were probably happy to see that his death was avenged, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I think that they probably were definitely like Team Harry after everything that happened with Cedric. I definitely think that it was, I mean, I would have been interested to see their reaction to the way that the Ministry was denying everything, because that's a huge slap in their face. Like, that's almost like, you know, it's even more of an insult to them than it is to Harry.
Well, yeah, and then also like the articles in the Daily Prophet in the 5th book that we don't ever really see but are sort of hinted at basically suggest that like Harry's the reason that Cedric died, and like that Harry even maybe killed Cedric. So that's super painful for the Diggories too. I'm really glad. It would have been really dark if the author had done this, and I'm glad that she didn't. Of like the Diggories sort of leading the charge against Harry. I could almost have see that happening.
Ooh, yeah, I wouldn't like that.
Yeah, and I'm glad it didn't happen that way.
No, I think that they believe Harry, and I think that they...
I think so too,
But that's where I'm saying, like, I wonder if Mr. Diggory continued working for the Ministry or what he did, because that seems like that'd be pretty tough to continue working for the Ministry when they're flat out denying the reasons that his son died.
Yeah, totally. I definitely agree. So Amos has been, I mean, this has been a short character study, but I do think it's for such a brief character, I mean, character who's only in the series really one book and only for a few chapters in the book, like we do get to know quite a bit about his character, because I think we see him in quite a few different lights, and quite a few different situations. So let's give Amos our character rating on our 4-point scale: heart, humor, uniqueness, creativity, and depth. What about heart? How many stars should he get for heart?
It's tough because he's got two contradicting plots. I think if it was just the Cedric plot, I would give him like a pretty high score. But once we've worked in the Winky plot, I don't know. That brings him down a lot. So I would maybe give him like a 3 or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably the right number. I was thinking maybe 4, but I definitely don't want to go over 4. I think 3 seems right though, just because for a character that we know so little about, like we see a lot of passion from him. Some of it though is a little bit colder though, so I don't want to go super high for him. So I think that seems right.
As far as humor goes, he's not a very humorous character. Although I guess like some of the times when he talks to Harry and is like,
yeah, I do like the awkwardness of his character when he like sort of is rude to Harry, and then like when he kind of makes a fool of himself in front of Crouch and that kind of thing. So it's not like he's completely. I would give him a 2 at least, but
yeah, I agree. I would maybe a 2.
Yeah, it is pretty funny when he talks to Harry, but that's also not like, I don't know. There's also some times where he's really not funny at all. So,
agreed.
What about uniqueness and creativity? Obviously, we can't go under 3.
I was gonna say, like, honestly, for who he is, he's a lot more unique and creative than what we could have gotten. You know what I mean? Like, he definitely had a lot more aspects to his character, and maybe I'm verging into depth, but I do think, like, there's no one else like him. It's always kind of what I say.
True. So
I would maybe give him
5 stars?
I would say maybe a 3. I don't think he should really get too high, but...
No, I mean, we've never given below a 3, so obviously we're not going to start that today, but I don't think he really deserves more than 3.
Right.
And then what, for depth, maybe 2?
Yeah, I was going to say 2 as well, because he's better than a 1. He definitely has some depth, but
yes,
we don't really know much about him at all.
Right, exactly. So it's a grand total of 10 points for Amos.
Yeah, Amos is not topping the charts, but he's doing okay.
He's doing fine. For considering we literally see him for like 3 chapters in the entire series. So yes, you can find those character ratings and rankings on our website, realweirdSisters.com. Alice, when's the last time those were updated?
Now it started to have been a while, so okay. I'll have to update those soon again.
Okay, well, just checking. And that is, again, realweirdSisters.com. We're also on Facebook at facebook.com/realweirdSisters, on Twitter at realweirdsister, Instagram at realweirdsisterspod. And, of course, we just want to make sure that you're subscribed to the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, whether it's on Apple Podcasts, which was recently updated, and apparently the update is awful. I have not updated mine, and I haven't listened to podcasts in a while, so I've heard some bad things about the updated podcast app. So maybe it's time to switch over to Spotify, which we are also on, or Stitcher, which we're also on, or any of the places where you listen to podcasts. You can listen to us anywhere. We are everywhere.
We are everywhere.
Exactly. Which is into non-being, which is to say everything.
Exactly.
Well said. Well reasoned. But make sure that even if you're not listening on Apple Podcasts, that you have given us a 5-star review on that iTunes or Apple Podcasts. We have one this week to read from Radar 300. And the title of this review is "This is a good podcast for Harry Potter fans." Well, that's what we're for, so that's good. So Radar says, "I am one of those fans who do not have anyone to talk about the novels and the movies. About the novels and the movies. My friends and family will look at me weird whenever I want to have an in-depth conversation about the Harry Potter universe. But then I found this podcast back in late 2016, and I have been listening ever since." This was written a few months ago. "After the chapter reviews and discussions ended, I thought this podcast would come to an end, but a new phase began. I love the character study episodes, and I look forward to listening to discussions on whatever Harry Potter-related topics you two come up with. There is one strange thing about the hosts. Alice and Martha appear to be publishing this show in a parallel universe where the Prisoner of Azkaban movie adaptation is not the best out of the 8 films. Somehow their show is still downloadable in this universe." So I hope that this person is enjoying our Take 5 series. It's reviews like this that inspired us to do Take 5. I'll say that.
Yeah, I think maybe this listener is in a parallel universe, not us.
I mean, I don't know what they're talking about, but truly, the number of listeners who love the Prisoner of Azkaban movie, that is part of why we are doing the Take 5 series, so I hope that they're enjoying it.
Yes, agreed. It's a lot of fun to kind of argue with those people, and one of them has been on the show as a guest several times now, so...
Yes, we do have one guest who's often on the show who loves the Prisoner of Azkaban movies, and he is a guest on our show a lot. So, again, if you have not given us a 5-star review, please do so. Of course, the number one way that you can support the show is by going to patreon.com/realweirdSisters. That is patreon.com/realweirdSisters, and it is WEIRD, not WYRD, as somebody in the Front Row Film Roast chat asked last week. But please make sure that you are considering, at the very least, supporting us financially. That is a huge lift for us to have our patrons supporting us in our Facebook group, in our Discord server, just in our monthly patron cast that we do. We really get we love our patrons and are very grateful for their support. So please consider supporting us there if you have not already. And next week, Alice, we're going to be back for another Take 5. It's going to be Take 5.
Ooh, I'm excited.
Double Take 5. Take 5 squared. I can't wait. And until then, we're the Real Weird Sisters.
We're the Weird Sisters, we're the real Weird Sisters. All you other Weird Sisters are fine, we're not the vicars. We're the real Weird Sisters. Please stand up. Please stand up. Please stand up.
IBM Cloud offers millions of different server configurations with 20 terabytes of bandwidth cost-free. Get the compute power you need and deploy on demand, but at prices set for smart cost management. Visit ibm.biz/baremetal servers to customize your server today.
Streaming only on Peacock, a new original comedy.
Me in a punk band?
We Are Lady Parts.
A confused mix of hash anthems and sour girl power.
You puked all over the front row. Ew.
We Are Lady Parts. All episodes streaming now, only on Peacock. Streaming only on Peacock.
John Wayne Gacy killed 32.
Straight from the killer's mouth.
They want you to believe that I alone committed these murders.
The new gripping 6-part documentary series, John Wayne Gacy, Devil in Disguise. All episodes streaming now, only on Peacock.